Welcome to the Push Ventures podcast, Push Your Advantage, and thanks a lot for tuning in. This installment is part of the Push Your Partner series of interviews, and in our interview series, we're discussing various topics with different contributors to the African tech ecosystem. And today, our guest is Caitlin. She's a healthcare nut. She worked in government hospitals, led major public health initiatives across the continent, and co founded FLAIR, the 911 for Africa, several years ago. She's a grad from MIT Sloan School of Management, where she studied finance. Caitlin calls both Chicago and Nairobi her home and currently lives in Kenya's bustling capital with her family. Together, we'll speak about the journey of Flair from idea to post Series A startup. We'll be touching upon points of the early days, which means the idea generation and piloting of such, then the first investors she got money from, and then the first big checks where she got real bigger amounts of money from, and then where she is now and where she's planning to go and where she sees the company going. So, Caitlin, thanks for being here. And are you ready to be pushed?
Thank you so much for having me today, Ben.
Wonderful. Let's talk about your early days, which is, I know, some time ago, and it probably feels like almost half a lifetime ago. But when you think about those early days, how did you end up coming up with your idea? Did you make an observation, or did you have an experience that gave you that, that particular aha moment when you're like, this is what I'm going to do?
It's, the question I always get asked is whether or not I had an emergency, could not get access to an ambulance, and whether or not that's the reason I started the company. And truth be told, that is not the reason I started the company. My entire career has always been in healthcare and healthcare systems and looking at how you make healthcare accessible. People talk a lot about access, but I think oftentimes in indirect ways. And I think as I was thinking about what was next while I was doing my MBA, one of the things I kept thinking about was access. Is how do you actually make healthcare accessible? And in markets like Kenya and across Africa, there's been a lot of attention of bringing healthcare closer through community health workers or closer to the community. But there's been no attention put towards how do you actually bring people into the healthcare system? And so what started as really kind of a exploratory, brainstorm conversation allowed Maria, my co-founder, and I to stumble upon this massive billion-dollar opportunity of emergency services that are heavily overlooked, considered totally impossible to execute because they require unbelievable precision and quality. And therefore, we thought, what better to spend your time in life doing is to focus on one of the hardest problems that exists. Because we don't have days, we don't have years, we have seconds that can make the difference between whether or not, a patient can survive an acute emergency situation.
Wow, that's very insightful. And now that you had this idea, how did you go about evaluating whether this is an idea worth pursuing, whether this is, as you mentioned, $1 billion market?
It was gradual. It wasn't as if it was, we identified this and the next day we started a business. It really took the next 6 months to a year to really learn about this space. I am not a paramedic. I've never worked in an emergency service department. I've watched plenty of ER and Grey's Anatomy, but that does not give me the expert title to be able to then create. So a lot of it was then spending the next year just learning, and that included things like being in the back of the ambulance. So I used to ride in the back of the ambulance and just witness what was happening, and identify that there are ambulances, or what happens when you arrive at a hospital. Does it look like it looks like on the TV shows? What's going on? And just talking to people. I was not in a mad rush to like start a company, and so I think that in hindsight, that was one of the most amazing parts of this journey, was just being able to honestly listen, understand what existed and didn't exist as we kind of better formulated what were we going to do. Because we didn't know how, we didn't know what we were going to do, but we knew that we needed to solve this massive, massive problem.
So now that you knew which problem to solve, if you think back, what did your kind of first prototype look like and how did you go about testing that product?
The first prototype, I mean, I don't even know what version we're on, maybe 1,000. So we've gone a long way. The first prototype of our product, one of the things that we quickly identified was an issue was that the average ambulance fleet was about 1 to 2 ambulances. And so that just means that, it's a really, really inefficient and friction filled market for the patient or a hospital to be able to access. Because if that one ambulance isn't available, then they have to go to the next ambulance and then the next ambulance. And so you're just kind of going down this phone tree when you're losing a patient in front of yourself. Um, and so what we zeroed in on, though, was the other problem, which is like oftentimes investors' favorite question to us is like, how do you deal with traffic? Funny enough, it's actually not that hard now that, version one was literally just mapping in real time where ambulances existed. It wasn't delivering a service. It wasn't, opening up a dispatch center. It wasn't having a, product that we could sell, but it was just visualizing for the first time where ambulances existed. And then from that, we could build, everything. And so that was what version one was. It was literally a map that digitized where ambulances existed in the city, such that you had that visibility for the first time.
That's really wonderful for you to point that out because, as you're saying, it's version one. It's very early. It was just that first step. So why don't you let us into your vision at that point? What were you actually thinking that this is what we actually want to go out there and build?
There are so many things that have changed and evolved and pivoted and all of those, startup jargony words in our company. But one thing that we've never veered from is our vision. So the vision that we developed from day one is the same vision that we have today, that no matter where you are and no matter who you are, you deserve access to emergency care in minutes. And so that was always our vision. I think the big piece around really how we were going to do that, that's where we've really flexed a lot of like, how do you actually make sure that you can do that? I think at one point we thought we were going to be a SaaS product, quickly realized that in this circumstance that wasn't going to work or cut it. You can't just be a software. There's a lot of operational as well as financial barriers to accessing emergency services that also had to be addressed. Uh, so there's definitely a lot of kind of movement on how and evolution, and we're still evolving that today. But I think as it relates to the vision, the amazing, not amazing, but the part about that is it stayed true from the beginning.
That's great. So you're basically true to your roots still today, where you are, which is wonderful to hear. But as you mentioned, version one was only the first iteration of a product. So why don't you tell us about a time when you had to pivot the company's product and strategy a little bit? And what led you to that insight to make that decision that we have to change here a bit?
Yeah, I'll talk about a couple of two important kind of moments in the company. I think one was transitioning from being purely more of a software infrastructure to a company that is providing the core operations, behind emergency services. So today, not only do we build the tech that is used by and for the ambulances with and across the country, but we also run the dispatch center. So all emergencies are, triaged through us. We are dispatching ambulances and really believe in the kind of medical, providing the medical care over the phone and really allowing for that to happen. I think one important moment that we had was actually during 2017. It was the presidential election of Kenya, and there's a lot of anxiety just surrounding presidential elections. I think it's normal, natural, coming from the US. I also have my own anxieties about the US presidential elections. But yeah, so there was a lot of anxiety leading up to the election and a lot of concern that, emergency services, if something were to happen, they weren't well coordinated. Now, we were behind the scenes sitting on just tremendous amount of insight and information already. We had already mapped, I think at this point, like 25 ambulances, which today seems like nothing. We have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ambulances on our system, but back in the day, 25 seemed like a meaningful amount, particularly when the average ambulance company was one or two. So there's like 10 to 12 companies that we had put onto the system. And so that was really the moment that we launched our dispatch center, as we realized that there was a very, very integral part of emergency services that cannot just be wiped away by technology. It is a level of coordination that requires, the human intervention, and more from a, empathetic or a kind of personal touch, in the day of ChatGPT and Bard, there's a lot of things that can be replaced in dispatching with, language processors, but there's a lot that cannot, particularly on kind of the emotional and supportive side that you play. And so that was a big moment where we opened our dispatch center and really fully realized the power of a dispatch center. It's really the nerve center of emergency services, that command center, like in a military. It is where you allow all of that kind of chaos that might be happening outside to be dealt with in a very controlled and methodical way, such that ultimately the person gets the care they need. So that was one big change that we had made, but that was back in 2017. I think another big change that we made was actually during COVID. In March of 2020, there was a lot of, again, anxiety and kind of fear about what was going to happen. I remember even as a company, we put out these like harrowing, awful statistics about how many hospital beds we needed and didn't have, or how many ventilators didn't exist. And so there was a lot of, fear, rightfully so, because advanced healthcare is limited. But thankfully that didn't play out the way that, we had forecasted. But I think what emerged was just that in that kind of lockdown, when people were, at home and weren't going to healthcare as frequently, this whole issue of access popped up again, is that women were not being able to get to the hospital to deliver. And that's like the best and most obvious use case is like, you should deliver in a hospital because you don't know that you're going to have a complication, or you don't know what kind of care you need after you deliver the baby. And so I think during that time, what it allowed us to do is to start to move into a lot larger scale kind of service contracts, what we call them. So prior to COVID, we really dominated in selling memberships to corporates and individuals, of which is a really important part of our business model today. But I think the kind of the introduction of some of these access challenges just realized that what we were doing was so relevant and so important, and that we could start actually working with, subnational kind of governments or the national government to really offer our service, and particularly for, patients that really, really needed to get to care urgently when they needed care.
You said very interesting things. One thing I heard was ChatGPT and Bard, which I'm going to ask you something about later on as well. But most importantly, as you mentioned, you're dealing with humans as well, and you had to build, for example, that control center, right? So now let me ask you, essentially, how did you go about in those early days about building a great team? I think a lot of want-to-be founders or soon-to-be founders out there who are listening to this might be interested in how did you and Maria, for example, meet? How did you know that the two of you should go about starting this together? And then how did you make your first hires? What were you looking for in people apart from their qualifications from an academic perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the, I think when people talk about success, they always ask, do you feel like you're lucky or hardworking? And I mean, I think I'm definitely both, like in the sense of, but I think one of the luckiest things is meeting my co-founder Maria. I don't think that if I had started a company and considered at the time of starting who I wanted to be my co-founder, I think that people tend to naturally kind of pick maybe someone who's a little bit, exactly like themselves. I don't know. I think people like to work with people that are like themselves. But I think I was lucky in the sense that she and I are unbelievably complementary, but also unbelievably supportive supportive, of each other, and also have the right skill set to balance out each other as well. So I think that that was, to be honest, pure luck. We were introduced through a common, connection. And, she and I don't think we understood what we were doing, but during that kind of that period that I was describing, where we took about almost a year to just explore this question of what emergency services look like, we went on that journey together. So we didn't, from the day of meeting, we didn't, open up the business, start hiring people, but we really spent that year building that foundation together, building that relationship, and both realizing that we were equally as curious and committed to this problem, and equally as excited by what lay ahead. And so I think that that was, to be honest, pure luck, that we met and were introduced. And I definitely we could have not gotten to where we are without each other. I think as it relates to the team, like we've definitely throughout the course, like flexed on different things. I mean, I think on the tech side, we have an incredible and super experienced team. Not to say it's easy hiring tech, but I think that, in some ways it's very clear what you need or want, or what kind of skills to evaluate, or can they do it? I think on the other side of the business, which is like everything else, from operations to sales to um, finance, I think sometimes those are a little bit less clear. So I think in the early days, the biggest thing that we hired for was passion and interest and commitment. And so even when you look at our kind of initial team, we all had two totally different skills. People were filling roles that they had no background in, but they were super passionate about it, and, were willing to figure it out together. I think over the years, we've transitioned to hiring much more based on like skills and competencies. Like, can you actually do this job? Are you actually capable of this? I think in all honesty, though, sometimes we've over indexed on that. We've prioritized like, can you do that? Did you have this background in X and therefore this? And I think that does not replace passion. And so I think that that's always something that we're kind of recalibrating around, of like, how do you make sure that you hire the right people for the right time of the business? But how do you also make sure that, this is not the easiest job that you could have? How do you make sure that you don't miss out on hiring people that have passion and connection to what we're doing, as well?
All right, wonderful. I think passion is truly important in anything we do. With that being said, maybe we talk about how did you actually go about finding your first investors? Because I think perhaps passion even plays an element in that regard as well. So who did you kind of approach, or which circles did you try to navigate, and how did you evaluate your investors' passion when those first checks were being written back in those days?
Yeah, raising money. So this would have been back in 2016. I had actually graduated from business school, and I had a job starting in September. I was to work at the IFC. And so we had 3 months, and I had debt that I was sitting on from business school. And so we had a very short window. It was either we raise money, we do this company, or if we don't, then I likely will have to go back to the US and take on you know a job like working with the World Bank. And so I think that that pressure and that time, was everything, because it was a bit of a urgent race against time. At this point, we had nothing more than a deck. We've saved all of our historical decks. They're actually cool to go all the way back to like version 1 of our decks. We've also had like 1,000 versions of our decks, but yeah, it was nothing more than a deck. And so at that point, we have taken I would say, rather traditional kind of investment path compared to like US companies, similar to that, in that we didn't bootstrap. We knew that we could not bootstrap because I was sitting on, a mountain of debt from business school. And also, we knew that we needed to have capital to build, because what we were doing is not also straightforward. It's a system that you must invest like millions and millions and millions of dollars into, because the last thing that you want is a 911 that doesn't work. Or is halfway built. There's no halfway baking a 911. It's either you build it properly and you deliver it, or you don't. So it's like an all or nothing type of business. So our first checks were from family and friends. And so that got us through, the first, year. Again, it was just Maria and myself. Maria wrote the first lines of code within our, product. It allowed us to hire a couple of like short-term contractors to help. But we did not hire a single operational person. I was the one that was testing the product in the field, going in the back of the ambulance, building the business models, doing all that. And so it was an incredibly lean operation. I think from there, though, then we started to attract angel investors. Some of our earliest angel investors were or are, individuals in the Kenyan healthcare system. So Kenyan physicians or another Kenyan health entrepreneur who had witnessed this exact problem that we were trying to solve. They had seen firsthand the challenges that they experienced trying to move a patient, the cost that it had on life. And so those were some of our earliest angels. I mean, from there, then we kind of raised some impact funds. Then we have done corporate VC. Then we've done VC, family offices. So the full like array and portfolio, we've kind of gone through those kind of steps along the way.
Okay, but now if we focus on your angels, the first ones, you mentioned a few physicians and someone who really experienced that problem that you were solving. How did you go about screening them and maybe evaluating them for their passion and support?
I mean, I think in the earliest days, you are just so excited for anyone to write you a check. So I would be fibbing you to say that we like intensively interviewed them. I think that, oftentimes these were outreaches. I think angels are a bit of a trickier. I think now, like 7 years later, there's a lot more kind of formalization around angel groups, but back then there weren't. It wasn't like we could go to the Nairobi Angels, or, if they existed, they weren't really that present, or, there wasn't, or the individuals that were going to be angels in us weren't in those networks. So, the initial angels that we got were also completely happenstance. A lot of my work in the early days was literally just like preaching that this was something that people should pay attention to. So whether that was at events, whether that was at conferences, whether that was having like, I don't know, 5 coffees a day with different people. And through that, that's where we actually got some of the angels. So one of our angels, actually, she read a newspaper article about us. I remember the first meeting we met at Java for coffee, and she brought the newspaper article. And I was like, wow, okay, and she had actually asked a friend to find us, to figure out who we were and to set up a meeting. Or one time I went and I was, again, we didn't have a product to sell yet, but I was meeting with another healthcare company and just learning about, and this was a healthcare company that was doing a lot of like tech and systems integration. And so I was sitting in a room of like 10 other, management and executives from this healthcare company. And after that meeting, one of the people in that room emailed me and said, I want to invest in you. So it was these totally kind of random events. I think that the only thing that I could point to be helpful is just that in those early days is like, yeah, speaking to as many people as possible. And then sometimes those are the individuals, the angels then almost come forward. I know that might sound fake, but in our case, that was exactly what happened, is that we had to meet so many different people, and the angels actually came not from like doing formal pitches or doing things like that, but it was actually from these kind of interactions that we had and connections.
All right, that's wonderful of you to say, and I think it's also true, as you mentioned. Back in the days when you started raising angel funds, a lot of the networks that we see today in the ecosystem weren't as present as they are now, and it was a bit harder. But I really like that newspaper part of the story, to be honest. When you're thinking about these first investors, what did they provide to the business apart from just the money? What's the additional value add that they could give you?
So the initial angels, a lot of it was just supportive capital, because that's what we needed. We needed money to be able to build something more than a pretty pitch deck. We needed money to be able to build that first prototype. We needed money to buy time, And so I think that that money was critical to getting us to where we are today. Um, Most of our angels were from Kenya. And so that was also super helpful in the sense of as we were navigating various questions or points in the business, oftentimes were, but it was angels are, yeah, angels in the sense that they really do, provide that kind of initial kick for startups to get going. And it doesn't usually come with unbelievable expectations around reporting or compliance or all of that stuff. It's purely like, I believe in you, I believe in this business, go do something with it.
That's really good because, as you mentioned, angels are angels, and I think that's also what they're supposed to do. So it shows that you selected them well, or they selected you well, whichever way actually it happened. Now, if you're thinking about kind of where you are today, and are you thinking about some of the core learnings that got you there, that led to like maybe product iterations or changes in the business and its strategy? Are there some that you can point to which wouldn't have been possible without your early investors, where they helped guide you, where they, as you mentioned, said, "Hey, I believe in you. I believe in this company that you're building, but this is kind of the way you might want to go or consider."
No, I mean, I really think angels play a very different role in a business. I know that, we're going to talk about like bigger checks and stuff like that, but I think the thing with angels is they're not trying to influence. It really is like, I believe in you as a founder. Like at this point, we're so early stage that what are they judging? If they're judging version one of the product, then they're missing the plot. Like that's not it. It's the vision. So it's really about backing the individual and the person, and whatever happens to this company, they believe that that entrepreneur is resilient enough to weather the storm, is capable of raising money, which is obviously like you need to continue to raise money, and believe in the service. So I wouldn't say. I think like when we started getting our next checks, that's where we actually realized how important it was to select the right investors, because they want to have a voice, they want to have influence, and sometimes you don't want that. In all honesty, as a startup, like you not because you believe that you're always right, but it's very very challenging to manage that many voices. And too much feedback is oftentimes paralyzing. So I think in the sense of angels, I think that yeah, there isn't that same level of expectation, and there isn't that same level of interest of like, let me, manage how you do this.
So, summing up, you definitely had the right angels looking after you. And if any of them are listening to this, kudos. Thank you very much. And as you said as well, we'll also be speaking about the bigger checks. So maybe let's go to that. As you said, as you were growing and, angels were also considering, can you raise more funds? At some point, you had to go out and approach those bigger checks, VCs, for example. When did you decide that it was about time to actually go and do that? Was there something within the business happening? Was it something that you saw, or was it, I needed more money, I needed bigger checks?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was all of that. I think at some point in the business, we realized that it wasn't going to cut it. Just Maria and me and a couple developers, is like we actually had to have a team. I think that also, I do think being obviously like very experienced, like we weren't 20-year-old entrepreneurs, even though you could succeed at 20. But I think also being naive about this space allowed us to really dive in a way that meant that we oftentimes didn't fully recognize just how massive and challenging it was. Like, who builds a 24/7 business? That's a startup. You literally never stop. But I think that at a certain point, Maria and I recognized that if we were going to get to where we needed to get to, we had to have additional capital. At this time, though, like the ecosystem was picking up. So when we started, again, kind of just a lucky happenstance timing wise, there was a lot more money coming into Kenya, a lot more excitement. All of these like first funds that were getting set up were being set up in and around that time. So there was a community. So it's not like we had to like independently figure it out. There was, information that was coming to us of like, oh, there's this new healthcare fund, or there's this, or have you met this person? And one of my, I think, superpowers or things that I do is I talk to so many people every single week, like so many new people. So I think that there was a lot happening in the broader ecosystem, but also internally as a company, we very much realized that in order for us to build something meaningful in this space, like we had to have additional capital.
Okay. And when you were looking for that additional capital, were there your wish list of VCs where you said these were the ones you ideally wanted? And if so, why was that the case?
I think at this point, there are those companies or VCs that we know that we want to work with, or there are, certain investors, but not really because, back in 2017, 2018, there was no history on most of these funds. So it was more about who has money today to actually deploy, who is interested in healthcare, and that's a very slim portion of investment funds that want to touch healthcare, um, and who fits the right stage. So I think at that point in the company, we were not ever being selective. It was more like, okay, after you get to that end of the funnel, here's these 10 people that might, be interested. And just talking. I mean, I don't know, I can't count how many investors I've spoken to, but I would say it's over 500, like all across the world, all across Kenya, all across Africa, all across Europe, you name it. And so I think just like that volume. But back at this point, because this would have been 2017, 2018, there just weren't that many early stage funds. But there was like information that was, coming out about these new funds having capital, because this was right before like that takeoff of VC in this market, and ecosystem. And so I think that, again, we were lucky. We were lucky that we were in the right place at the right time where, fresh capital was coming into the market, early stage money, and we're able to then get those initial checks. The initial checks came from, again, it always was, and I think this is the hard part about raising capital, there's always some connection, whether it's a warm introduction from another entrepreneur, whether it's knowing someone from another point in your previous career, having that mutual link on LinkedIn, but all of them were from a kind of person level, some type of reputational connection, in some way to both Marie and myself.
Okay, and you mentioned that you've spoken to at least 500 investors, right? How did you, especially in those first stages, handle the disappointing no's from a founder perspective? Or I know as VCs sometimes don't really say no, but kind of just show how did you like handle that situation?
I think the nose, I mean, I don't know if it's like I need thicker skin or whatever. They're never get easier, because like as an entrepreneur, you're always like, charging ahead and, very, very committed and passionate and all this kind of thing. And when people say no, I think though sometimes though, the no's have changed. And I think in general, the no's are oftentimes not the real reason for no's. I think investing is not a science at all. Um, maybe later stage for sure, but not at this point. So I think a lot of the no's are hard in the sense that it does sometimes feel personal, or it's just like this person doesn't connect with it. So I think that was what makes it harder, because sometimes the no's will be like, well, you need to get to X. And then we would do X and come back, be like, we did it, here it is. And then they're like, well, now you need to do Y. And it's like, you just keep changing the goalposts. So I think that, I think that's the difficult part, is in the early days, the no has nothing actually to do with the business or the opportunity or the potential. But it's purely this kind of gut feel of, hey, I want to back you or I don't want to back you. But it sometimes comes off as a super scientific, methodical checklist and forms and all this crazy stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not. I think what we've gotten better at, though, is identifying from that first call. And this is something that I do now, is what's the chance of that person saying no? And if it's high, like, don't try to convince them. You know what I mean? If they come in and they're already like, well, I've seen companies like this and they haven't succeeded, they come in with that negative energy, get them out. Like, we don't want, it's very difficult to kind of get that person back. And so I think what we've got better at is cutting it off, before you're investing a lot of time. Because I think once you're investing a lot of time, that's where it feels much more significant, because you're like, hey, I just put in weeks of time to try to get to that. So I think that's what we've done to really better understand is like from those initial calls. So even at the end of initial calls with investors now, I'm like, okay, so what are you thinking? Like, why would you invest in us? And I asked them that, and then they're like, well, I wouldn't. And you're like, okay, great, bye. Like, so I think just getting better about cutting it off sooner such that you don't feel like you've invested too much time in that.
Okay, now allow me to ask you a tough question. I know both you and Maria are two foreign women founders um, who are succeeding where others haven't, right? How do you feel about that in the sense of, do you feel at times that it's tougher because of your gender? And if so, can you let us in, particularly with regards to what would you say to a young woman out there who's now considering to start her own business as well?
I don't think that you can ignore a gender at all. It has 100% influence on who gets money and who doesn't. I think as hard as that might be to hear, it has not gotten easier. I think it's gotten even harder. I mean, you just look at the statistics, and I think I can't remember it, so don't quote me, but I'm sure that Bard or ChatGPT can correct me. But I mean, I think like women who, and if it's dual women, two women, not a man and a woman, but if it's both women, the percentage of women who make it past a Series A is less than 1%. Um, and so I think that the numbers do not lie. And I think that oftentimes, I think that's underplayed in the sense that individuals who get more capital have a better chance of then succeeding because you need money and then raising more money too. And so I think that it is a really, really broken system because if you're not able to raise money and it's much harder, then it's almost more difficult to then get that next check because, and for investors, they're almost like, well, my exit is that next check. And so it's just this, really, really difficult cycle that we're in that needs to be broken. So, I mean, there's nothing sugarcoating about it, 100%. I mean, you look at us and we are oftentimes the sole, if not only female back startup in most of our, investors funds. And I think that, yeah, I think that the only advice or recommendation, that I have is like, don't give up. Like there are, I think that that's the hard thing is like, and try to figure out how to survive. Um, and also realize that you are working in a broken system. So it's really okay to be upset sometimes about how unfair it can feel and how difficult it can be. But I think the only way to start changing it is for women to be in positions of power and for women to have money. Think about the wealthiest people today. Guess who they are? Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, like those need to be women. And once they start having money and at the top, then we can start changing stuff. So it doesn't help to like bow out, but it doesn't make it any easier.
Okay. So now talking about having money after your Series A, you had quite some money. And how did you go about, because you raised that money, right? And now you wanted to grow the business. So how did you go about developing your revenue, your customers and partnerships after this point?
Yeah, I think that as a business side, I mean, I think some of the things that happen is like we definitely have continued to um, build out our like membership offering and services and continue to add value to those customers. I had talked about like our evolution in COVID to these more large scale contracts. So I think that was a key thing. I think that our trajectory of a business though is just really different. And I think some people don't like to hear that, but it's true. It's not this just total rocket ship. It's much more like a staircase. You need to build, then stabilize. You need to grow and then stabilize. Then you need to grow and then stabilize. Because the nature of what we do is just so unbelievably critical that you have to not misstep at any point. So I think that our if someone were to ask us, right now we're in a stabilization phase. We're not in a growth phase. Like we can't grow until we stabilize. We can't, be able to take on more customers. We've grown, we've maxed out. Now we need to stabilize. Now we need to grow. Then we need to grow. So I think that for us, it's just a different period or phase on where you are. And I think the hard thing that is like you always have to time it right with the round because the expectation coming from investors is grow, grow, grow. And so sometimes you just have to figure out how do you balance those two kind of phases, and those are just the two phases that for us make sense. We can't be this like Uber blitz scaling company and have all these problems emerge just because the consequences are really, really different.
All right. Thank you so much for this. I think we've spoken a lot about your early journey, the first big checks as well. And then now, if we're looking at where are you now with your business and where you're planning on going, when you look at the business right now, where it is, you were just talking about the stabilization phase of it. How do you feel when you compare it to what we discussed in the beginning of the interview about those early days when you were riding in the back of an ambulance, figuring out how does this whole system work?
I mean, we have come so far. I think the hard thing of being an entrepreneur is you are hypercritical of everything. So, I mean, there are definitely days where Maria and I are not, I guess, proud or thankful enough and are like, well, we need to do this or this. And I think that's just the natural tendency. It's like to jump right back in and say, like, we need to do this. But when we kind of zero out and take a big step back, I think that the incredible things is like we have saved more than 15,000 people from previously impossible situations and saved their life for the better. We've done that every single time on an average of 15 minutes. Um, we have an incredible team of over 40 plus individuals. We're profitable. So I think there's like all of these different things that like in the moment, I think it's sometimes hard to just like take that step back and kind of recognize. And we are definitely not big self promoters. So we're not the ones that are on Instagram or LinkedIn talking about how fantastic we are. So I think that's always a constant check that, we do to make sure that you really do realize the progress that has been made because it's, tremendous.
Okay. And what do you believe are the key factors that have contributed to the success of the company so far?
Key factors to success of the company. One is almost, not giving up in the sense that like there have been, I don't know, 4 or 5 times where we've almost run out of money. There have been many events where I think otherwise someone would have just given it up. I do think because it's a dual founded company. Like I think as a single person founding the company, I don't think I could have made it. I was talking to Maria the other day, and it's like your co-founder is also your therapist beyond your strategist. It's also your therapist. So I think that, yeah, for sure. I think just that resilience and not giving up is totally it. I think the other thing is just like back to that earlier point, our vision has never changed. And I think that's really, really helpful because you have that anchor, and that anchor isn't being moved around. We know what we do. And we have never adjusted from day one. And I think as a result is like every day, it's part of what I do every day as I look and I read about a story or a case that we handled. So I never stay far from the actual work. So even while we have scaled to a much bigger team such that I don't have to be in the back of an ambulance, I don't, feel like I ever have lost touch of the actual impact in the work that we actually deliver.
That's a great point of you saying not being in the back of an ambulance now. When you're looking at those early days compared to now, and if you're thinking about your time spent in almost like a pie chart back then to now, how has that changed or evolved over time? How do you spend your time now in the sense of, even though you would like to maybe every once in a while ride the back of the ambulance, you don't do it anymore these days?
I think from a time perspective, I think there's definitely like pieces of what I do today that are still like individually contributing to the company. And that oftentimes are great cues of where we still need to build capacity or team. Because if I'm, directly doing X, it means that someone else or we don't have those skills or that experience on the team. So I think that there is definitely a percentage of that. Back in the day, like that was a huge percentage of what I did is because we didn't have a team. So I think like with that, obviously comes management and making sure. I think that we're in a point right now where we're actually getting big enough that you have to really transition from just being that manager to a leader, and making sure that you have the right managers and directors on the company to kind of fill that role. So I think it is definitely a constant evolution. I think the things that have never changed is like, I spend a good amount of time, talking to our customers or selling, at least opening those initial doors. We do now have an incredible, commercial director and sales team that can like pick those up and do that. But still, there is that magic that happens when you're the founder and can open those initial doors, and then also, fundraising. But I would say the biggest shift is like the individual contribution to now more of the management leadership, though, of course, I still do some of that, on a day-to-day basis.
When you're looking at that transition as well, one of the call it an anchor as well, which is supposed to give you a little bit of insight into how to steer your business as well, is your board. How did you go about building your board? And if you're thinking about that as well, how would you change it if you're like looking at the lessons from those early days compared to now? Is there something you feel like you would do differently today?
I think the board is such an interesting question because I think in the way that oftentimes boards get created is because of an investment round, and that is then a negotiated right or term. Now, of course, like from the inception of a company, you have a board, but oftentimes that doesn't mean that it's functional or not functional in the sense that it's dysfunctional, but it's just not like, regularly meeting and kind of carrying that all out. Um, and I think the biggest like thing that I would do, I guess, if I were to start another company, um, were to create that vision from the board from the onset, such that you are not then just kind of pushed into a structure. And so to really have that clear visibility around what a board could be. I think the challenge with a board is that there's a lot of examples around how boards aren't working. I think there aren't that many examples that you can always point to of where boards are working. And particularly like at my stage of the career, I'm not sitting on all these different boards. So I don't have that vantage point of like, hey, this looks good, this doesn't look good. I know what a good leader looks like because I've worked for a really good leader. I know what a good, someone who's good in operations look like because, I've worked with people like that. So I think that would be one of the changes that I make is just like from the onset, creating that similar vision, and really understanding what those profiles are, because I think then it will make it easier around who is elected or, gets the opportunity to be on the board versus just then it becoming a bargaining chip in investor conversations.
Okay. Another thing that's always important to build for any startup is a moat. And do you feel you've built that in East Africa? If you're looking at who are your competitors, and you said earlier that you're now looking at stabilizing the business and then doing an expansion later. How do you feel about your moat?
I think we definitely have a moat. I think the moat is created in a number of ways. I think one is we've been in the market now for a number of years. And so just the exposure and experience that we have is just unparalleled. And I think, through that, we just have an inherent, advantage. But I think like our product actually works. I think because of our growth path of grow, stabilize, not just grow, 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 grow. I think that at every turn, we've never compromised on the service and the care and the quality that we provide. So I think our moat is that we are very, very, strictly clear around how we're going to grow, less on, there's so many ideas, no one's short of ideas, whether in the company or investors about you should do marketing, you should do this, you should do that. But I think that has definitely been our moat, is really being clear about our vision from the onset, and having a methodology to how we grow that isn't just the same methodology that everyone uses.
Okay. And if you're looking at measuring success as well for yourself and the company, how do you look at that as a founder?
It's such an interesting question because I think there's like definitely aspects of it of like the company at large, like are you successful in the sense of are you serving more patients? Are you delivering more X? Are you, growing your revenue? Are you building a scalable business? So there's a number of metrics on that. I think from like a personal side, as a leader, I think the measures of success is like, you're not burnt out. You're still, inspired every single day that you wake up in the same kind of way that you were on day one. Because it never gets easier. I remember wondering early on, like, at what point is it going to get easier? And it never gets easier. It really doesn't. Not to dismiss, or not discourage, but I think it gets more interesting and more complex. But it doesn't get easier. So I think a term of success is: are you continuing to be as committed and passionate to this? And that's a huge factor for whether or not you will succeed.
Okay, when you're looking at where you are with your business now, where are you planning on going as well? And what do you feel were some of the biggest challenges you faced in growing the company to get it where it is right now?
Over the next several years, once we kind of finish the stabilization phase, we have like a major opportunity to scale geographically, add additional products on, that are complementary to some of our core products, and to continue to be not just Kenyan player, but a Pan-African player. There are still very, very few, if not examples, of companies like ours that are scaling across the continent in a way that makes sense. And so I think for us, it's really about how do we become that obvious choice for emergency services across the continent. And it's a really big opportunity and market to figure that out.
My last question before I have one last random question is, can you talk about a particular difficult decision you had to make on your journey as a founder?
One particular decision, I think that's just, yeah, every day. I feel like there's every day from, letting go of team members that aren't performing or can't make that transition. I think that's been really difficult that, as a company, you are nothing without a team. And so I think that continues to be one of the most challenging parts, is making sure that you identify, recruit, onboard properly team members, but then also transition out if they're not actually adding value. And I think that remains definitely from my side personally one of the hardest things to do, is because they're people's lives too, and they really matter. But it's really difficult to kind of get that right. And so I think that's something. But I think on a every single day basis, there's so many different things of like, do we take this opportunity in Uganda? And I'm just making that up. Or do we focus on Ghana, or do we do this? And so there's just this constant calibration and reprioritization and scenarios, of like, well, if we did that, then what would happen here? And what would do this? And so I find that, that is also really, really challenging, because you could make some pretty significant choices in a single day around the trajectory of your company.
That's 100% true. I have one last random question before I'll attempt and summarize some of the talking points that you basically voiced. My random question essentially is, are you using AI in any way? Because you already mentioned ChatGPT and BART, or are you looking at it and thinking that there is great applications in your business for it?
I mean, I think if you are running a business and not thinking about it, then you're behind the times. So, I mean, I think even on a day-to-day basis, we use ChatGPT and Bard or others all the time. And so I think that, just to make life and work easier, whether it's writing a proposal, whether it's doing a report, like there are a lot of writing a new policy. There's a lot of efficiency that can be gained just from an operations. And I think the amazing thing is like that actually will save companies a lot of money that are getting started, because you don't need to have all of the roles that you used to have. I think but beyond kind of like the use of it on a day-to-day basis, just to make those kind of more operational and administrative things easier, like develop a initial job description for X role. I think that, there's a huge role for AI to play in our company, and it is definitely, a big consideration of how we get that right over the next several years. I think that the really important balance that we must strike is that balance between AI and human. And so where is the human still superior? And where are they not? And, so we think about that heavily, particularly within the emergency dispatch space. Like, can AI replace that kind of empathy and that emotion and that support? Um, Probably not yet. But can they make sure that, for example, just think about our operations and our dispatch center, that our dispatchers never skip a beat on doing the right thing on protocols, 100%. And so I think that just figuring out that right balance is really key. But there's endless opportunities that we're considering within the business about how to make us smarter, better, and continue to retain that moat that we have.
And we're looking forward to you striking that right balance. Allow me to summarize some of the talking points, which is always a difficult thing because we've spoken for nearly an hour. But some of the things that I really took away from what you said were: first, is angels should be ideally no strings attached and always helpful. And you were lucky in having the right angels. Um, then luck also plays a part in your journey, but it doesn't replace the hard work as well. Because you pointed out how you had, for example, that lucky encounter meeting Maria, getting introduced to her. Another takeaway I had was that it's a tough journey to be a woman in this industry, and we generally need more women to succeed so that they then also invest more into women again. Perhaps that's because a lot of investors invest similar to how people hire people, because you mentioned sometimes when people hire, they're looking for people who are similar to them and who are like themselves in some way. Another very good point I liked was persistence pays off. You have to find your anchor, but you have to keep chasing that. And that anchor can serve as your big motivator on that journey. You further pointed out that building a board to identify the contribution that people can bring to the business is really something which should be considered, and not just have it kind of be an investment bargaining chip. And my last point I definitely took away was being a founder comes with a lot of difficult decisions on a daily basis. So, Caitlin, that was my attempt of a summary. Is there anything you feel I left out or something you would like to add from your perspective?
No, that was a great, yeah, great summary. And I mean, I think a great, things to push as well as like one of our investors and really supporting us in our growth and ensuring that we also have those right kind of doors and openings. And so, yeah, thank you for backing us, believing in us, and really helping us grow to get to where we are today.
Always. And to all the listeners out there, thank you very much for listening to this episode of Push Your Advantage podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook as Push Venture Capital, and on Twitter under Push Your Advantage. Thank you a lot, Caitlin, for being here and having this interview with me. And we'll be back next month with another episode on the African tech ecosystem, which is available on Spotify, Apple Music, AfriPods, and of course on YouTube.
Thank you.